Good morning, or depending on when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and I was always told I had a voice for radio, so I've made a podcast all about the Pokemon trading card game. But you're not listening to that right now. You are watching part 4 of my rotation series. What I'm doing is I'm going through set by set, showing you what we are going to lose in the rotation. Now, I have already done videos about Boundaries Crossed, about Plasma Storm, and about Plasma Freeze. Links to those will be in the description for this video, so I heartily recommend you go back and have a look at them before you have a look at this one. But just to remind you, it has been announced that the rotation is going to be X and Y on for standard as of September the 1st, 2015. What that means is that you will only be able to use Pokemon card sets from X and Y and later in standard tournaments, which means we are losing a whole bunch of sets, 5 in total, and I am doing these videos to show you the cards that we are going to be losing that will no longer be available for play in the standard format, to basically keep you guys up to scratch so you don't have to go and do all the research. I've done it for you. Now, this video also works in terms of, in expanded, you're going to actually be able to play with all the sets from black and white onwards. And we know that at least Houston regionals, if not all the regionals, are going to be played in this format. So you can also think of this video as what we gain in expanded from the Plasma Blast set. So it will work on that plane as well. And actually, I'd like to think this works as just a little history of the game, in that you can see all about one set in a lot of detail. And I'm not just going to tell you about the cards, I am going to tell you how they were used, how they could have been used, what we initially thought of them, all kinds of fun historical things. So, again, I've split them into categories here, and the first category is a new category for this particular video, cards that we've already seen. I don't wish to repeat myself. So, very quickly, Execute. Now, Execute did come up as a secret rare in the Plasma Blast set, and you don't really need to know much more about it. He was from Plasma Freeze, so I heartily recommend you go back to my Plasma Freeze video. It was all about his ability Propagate, and he was used in a number of ways in terms of filling the bench and using as discard fodder for cards like Ultra Ball. He wasn't a good Pokemon except for his ability, but his ability allowed you to fill the bench whenever you wanted, do these discards. He really was a very useful card. Similarly, Blastoise, who came around in Boundaries Crossed. We're not going to be talking about Blastoise because we talked about him in the Boundaries Crossed video. He was there with your Keldeo and with your Black Kyurem EX. We've talked about him quite a bit, and he actually was also reprinted in Plasma Storm as well as Boundaries Crossed. We've talked about him a fair bit. And the last one that we would be talking about, had we already not, I think, discussed it as much as we need to, is Dusknoir, another card we talked about at length in the Boundaries Crossed video. His ability Sinister Hand was great for a number of reasons, and I encourage you to check out my Boundaries Crossed video for more information. One more card that we're not going to be talking about in great detail is Professor Juniper. Now, Plasma Blast is actually, or was, the final printing of Professor Juniper, which means that it is being rotated by virtue of Plasma Blast going away, but we don't need to spend much time on Professor Juniper because Professor Juniper has been reprinted in all but name in the X and Y set, and indeed in the Phantom Forces set. So it's exactly the same card, just with a different name. And as I discussed in previous videos, if it's got a different name, even if it does exactly the same thing, think Gust of Wind and Pokemon Catcher before the errata that added the coin flip, you can only use the newer card. So even though Professor Juniper and Professor Sycamore are the same, you can only use Sycamore in tournaments. So let's have a look at the cards that I've termed, "Ooh, you had such promise." These are cards that looked really good, but then we never actually ended up using them in tournaments. You very rarely saw these. One of them was Craddle. Now, Craddle was a Stage 2 Pokemon. One of the downsides was it's one of these ones that evolves from Lileep, which is not a basic Pokemon, it is a restored Pokemon. So restored Pokemon, you have to use the fossil card. In Lileep's case, it is a root fossil. And when you play the fossil card, you have a look at the bottom 7 cards of your deck, and if you find Lileep in the bottom 7 cards of your deck, you get to put it on your bench. It's not just like a basic Pokemon. It does also mean you cannot start the game with it because it's not a basic Pokemon. Now, it did have a really good ability, and you could almost put Tortuga and Archon in here as well, although they didn't evolve into cards which were particularly relevant in this set, so we're just going to talk about Lileep and Craddle. But one of the big downsides here was that you had to use the restored Pokemon mechanic. Now, it did have the ability Prehistoric Call, like I was saying, and it means that if it's in your discard pile, you can put it at the bottom of your deck, which means that when you play Root Fossil, you are guaranteed to hit a Lileep. It's going to be in the bottom 7 cards of your deck. It's going to be on the bottom of your deck. But of course, that means you have to get the Lileep into the discard pile. Then you have to play the Root Fossil, and then it's one more turn until you can actually get Craddle out, because Craddle is a stage 1. Now, in the new set, we are going to be getting Broken Vine Space. It's called something like Forest of Giant Plants, but Broken Vine Space is a much better name to play on the old card Broken Time Space if you're a newer player. Now, with that card, Lileep can evolve into Craddle in one turn, which means you can just go Root Fossil to get the Lileep out, and then Craddle. So although you've still got the awkward restored Pokemon mechanic, it could be slightly better, which is very, very good indeed. Now we're looking at the first attack, Life-Splosion, stupid name, brilliant attack. For each energy attached to this Pokemon, and remember it says energy, not energy card, so double colourless energy counts double, search your deck for a stage 2 Pokemon and put it on your bench. This means you can have Pokemon like Blastoise, like Delphox, whatever you want, on your bench on turn 1. I mean, you could go Restored Fossil Lileep, evolve into Craddle. With 1 energy, you could then get your first stage 2 on the first turn of the game. You add a double colourless energy, and on turn 2, you can be, assuming you didn't go first, of course. If you go first, you can attack turn 1. On your second turn of the game, you can have 3 stage 2s being put on, plus the one you put there the previous turn. The combos are way, way too numerous to name. I've given you a couple of examples, probably not even the best examples, but any stage 2 put on there as if they were a basic. Here's another one, Empoleon. There's a stage 2 that saw quite a lot of play. Look out for people, now that Broken Vine Space is out, look out for Craddle in Expanded. It is potentially going to be absolutely brilliant. Now, another card which had a huge amount of promise, but quite frankly, nobody ever played, and I never saw this played in any tournament, was Mesprit. Now, he had the ability Mental Shroud. If you've got Mesprit and Uxie and Azelf in play, none of your Pokemon have weakness. But ladies and gentlemen, we have had all kinds of Pokemon and abilities and mechanics that get rid of weakness. They never see use. Levani from Noble Victories. Each of your Pokemon has energy attached to it, has no weakness. But it was, of course, a stage 2, and it wasn't worth the deck space. So, yeah. You know, we've seen other Pokemon like that. There was an Exploud which did pretty much the same thing. He was released back in the Supreme Victors set, and he didn't even need to have an energy attached to him, or your Pokemon didn't. He just got rid of all of your Pokemon's weakness, and he was a stage 2, so he was never played. We've got the Pokemon Tool Weakness Policy, which does remove the weakness from any Pokemon to which it's attached, and that doesn't see any play, because people would rather play tools like Muscle Band. And all of those things I've just told you were better and easier to use than this Azelf, because you didn't need 3 different Pokemon out. So, quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, I don't imagine it, it was never going to be good. If you want one more example, Plasma Frigate, even in all the Plasma decks that saw a huge amount of play, when Plasma Energy is attached to them, Plasma Frigate gave them no weakness, and even that didn't see any play. It really was... It was destined for failure. Unfortunately, we like to get rid of weakness. Weakness is a good thing, but apparently as players of this game, we are only interested if it's amazingly easy, and none of these were ever easy enough. Another Pokemon which could potentially have seen a lot of play that never did was Dialga EX. Now, I'm not talking about the Metal Dialga from Phantom Forces, which has seen a bit of play. I am talking about the Dragon Dialga EX from Plasma Blast, because of course this is a Plasma Blast video. Now, it had one interesting attack, Fast Forward, did 90 damage, for 4 colourless energy, but you can use plasma energy and double colourless energy. And remember, you can use Chorus Machine to get the plasma energy on there. For each plasma energy attached to this Pokemon, discard the top card of your opponent's deck. In theory, you could on the first turn of the game go plasma energy, treble Chorus Machine, or indeed just play 4 Chorus Machine, be hitting for 90 damage and discarding 4 cards off your opponent's deck. Or you could go DCE and 2 Chorus Machine and be doing 90 damage and discarding 2 cards from the top of their deck. It was very much kind of like the Tinnitus EX from Plasma Freeze, I want to say. It was far too expensive. You didn't want to put all your plasma energy in one basket. And of course, when you lose a plasma energy, it's really hard to recover them again. So nobody ever really played this. You can kind of imagine why. And another card, which could potentially have seen play for Plasma Pokemon, but never did, was the Pokemon Tool Reversal Trigger. And on paper, this looks like an amazing card. When the Team Plasma Pokemon this card is attached to is knocked out by damage from its opponent's attack, search your deck for a card and put it into your hand. Now, people love cards like Computer Search, which allows you to search for any one card at the cost of discarding 2 from your hand. Why do people never play Reversal Trigger? Well, there's 3 reasons. Firstly, cards like Startling Megaphone and Tool Scrapper got rid of it, meaning it couldn't be used. Secondly, it was only if a Pokemon was knocked out by damage, so Poison, most likely from a card like Hypnotoxic Laser, would stop this working. And people just really wanted to use tools like Muscle Band, which have always been more popular. All of those cards looked potentially game-breaking, especially Craddle II and Reversal Trigger, but they never saw play, so they get the "oh, you had such promise" categorization. And by never saw play, I don't mean that they never saw play, I mean they never saw any significant play. You might have played against 1 or 2 players at some point once upon a time that had them in their deck and didn't do very well in the tournament. I'm sorry, I'm not counting it. Please don't hate me. Now, a card that did see some play, so let's put it into the you used to be cool category. These are Pokemon that had, or trainers, that had a significant impact on the format, but have now gone and don't see any play anymore. Firstly, Drifblim. Now, he could have gone in the saw occasional use section, but he really was a big part of a lot of decks. He was a real part of counter decks, like the Flareon card, and in fact, he did feature in the Flareon deck, with which I managed to get 5th at the ECC back in 2014. Am I talking about that too much in these videos? I fear I might be. 2 good things about him. Firstly, the attack does 70 damage and discards a special energy. That's pretty good. The attack cost of 3 is a bit steep, but not too steep, especially with double colourless energy, to stop people using this outside of counter plasma decks. But we love the ability here. The attack cost is 1 less for each of your opponent's Team Plasma Pokemon in play. They put 3 Plasma Pokemon down, you get a free attack. And Team Plasma Pokemon, because of plasma energy and things like prism energy, because they'd have their Thundurus and their Kyurem, which, you know, your lightning and your water Pokemon, they really relied on special energy. Most of them only played a couple basic energy, if any. So getting rid of their special energy, while being able to do a huge amount of, a decent amount of damage, was brilliant. And of course, he comboed very nicely with a Dragon's Exalted Drifblim that did 50 damage times the number of special energy in your opponent's discard pile. And people like myself would play both of them in a deck. It was a really good card. It saw a big amount of play, but it hasn't seen play for quite some time. Speaking of cards that used to see quite a lot of play, but haven't for some time now, the Sigilif. Now, this isn't the Safeguard Sigilif, this is the Toolbox Sigilif. You can have up to 4 Pokemon cards, tool cards, attached at one time. Now, this means that you can put like 4 Eviolites on there and reduce 80 damage. You could put 4 Silver Bangles on there and do 120 extra damage for each of your attacks. But really, this was used with the Trubbish from Plasma Storm. Now, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. I talked about this at length in the Plasma Storm video. I encourage you to go back and have a gander in that one. Just flick through till you find it. It can't be that difficult. But this tool drop deck was really, really good. And if you notice Trubbish's attack tool drop, it does 20 damage for each Pokemon tool attached to each Pokemon in play. And that was an absolute maximum of 6 on your side, 6 on your opponent's. But of course your opponent wouldn't put down any tools they didn't have to. Well, with Sigil, you could put 4 on there. So you really could have potentially 16 just on the Sigil alone. And then you could put another 2, well, 1 each on the other 2 Pokemon. And have 18 Pokemon tool cards to do 360 damage. Now, nobody, I don't think, ever actually did that. But the point is, you really could just pile these tools on there. Speaking of Pokemon tools, the last card which used to be cool, and this was a very popular tech for a while, popular enough that it gets into the You Used to Be Cool section, Silver Mirror. And Silver Mirror was very simple. It basically made you immune to attacks from Team Plasma Pokemon, which was incredibly useful, because okay, maybe your Team Plasma Pokemon, or Team Plasma decks, maybe they'd be playing Tool Scrapper. But an awful lot, and by the way, this could only be used on non-EX, it wouldn't work on EX Pokemon. But it means that if your Plasma opponent didn't play cards like Tool Scrapper, or they were prized, or they had to discard them, or they just used them all, Silver Mirror basically let you sit there and go, boom, now you can't win. And yeah, they could use cards like Pokemon Catcher or Genesec's Red Signal ability to bring a bench Pokemon active, but as long as they couldn't take all of their prizes that way, sooner or later they had to deal with the Pokemon that had the Silver Mirror attached. And if they had no way of getting rid of the Silver Mirror, and they had no non-Plasma Pokemon, as an awful lot of Team Plasma decks didn't, they couldn't win. And that is gives me a nice segue into the Saw Occasional Use category with Chatot, and his attack Misinformation. Discard all Pokemon tool cards attached to each of your opponent's Pokemon. Now, on the one hand, this worked as a very nice tech against Trubbish decks, get rid of all their tools, now they ain't winning, but it also worked as a nice card that you could put into Team Plasma decks, and it would be essentially your Silver Mirror counter. It never saw a huge amount of play, it never became a staple in these Plasma decks, but it did see a fair amount of play. It had a retreat cost of 1, it had an attack cost of 1, you could use cards like Colress Machine to get it going without using your attachment for the turn. It really was quite useful. Wasn't amazing, never saw a huge amount of play, but it was useful. Just like Mascarene. Now, shout out to Coach Strip Ollie Fenley, who tried putting Mascarene in basically every deck towards the end of its life. And it was I must confess, if you look at the attack is kind of useful. 60 damage, you put a Silver Bangle on that, that's 90 damage, and that'll KO something like a Seismitoad just weak to grass. But really, it's the ability tool reversal. You just get to switch all your tools around. Now, Trubbish, the tool drop decks, and tool drop apparently gained quite a bit from Plasma Blast. These really would benefit from Mascarene, because you could, for instance, put a Silver Bangle on there if you're facing up against an EX, or a Muscle Band if you're facing against a non-EX, or a Silver Mirror if you're facing against a Plasma Pokemon. And if your opponent switches what their active Pokemon is, you can switch your tool to deal with this. It was also really good for Primal Groudon decks. You could have the Spirit Link on there while you evolved, then you could take it off and use something like Weakness Policy in its place. Never saw a huge amount of play, but I'm assuming you're getting this by now, it did see a little bit of play. Speaking of grass Pokemon that saw a little bit of play, Tropius. Now, he had 2 moderately interesting attacks. For 1 grass energy, he could do Return, and you got to draw cards until you had 6 in your hand. It was good if you had nothing else, just as a consistency crutch. But he also had the card Energy Press. 20 damage, plus 20 for each energy card attached to the defending Pokemon. Now, it did take 2 energy attachments, and this was a problem, but as I talked about with Leafeon in my previous Plasma Freeze video, you would be surprised how many energy your opponent puts down. Now, Tropius isn't as good as Leafeon was. Leafeon was all energy attached to all of their Pokemon for 1 energy. Tropius is energy attached to only the active for 2 energy. But against something like a Keldeo that was weak to grass and often put a lot of energy on, he was pretty gosh darn good. Now, Frostlast, I could have put into the all you had such promise category. It's got a really nice ability, Cursed Glare. As long as this Pokemon is your active Pokemon, your opponent can't attach any special energy cards from his or her hand to his or her Pokemon. And I've already said that there are decks like Plasma which pretty much only use special energy. There's all kinds of decks like Flareon that really rely on double colourless energy. But the attack's kinda garbage. 30 damage plus 10 to all of the bench for 2 energy, it's not great. It's a Plasma Pokemon, so Colress Machine is up for grabs. You can use Deoxys to make it do more damage. I played against this card a lot more than I ever expected to, which is why it makes it into the sore occasional use category. But I honestly don't think it was ever particularly good. Brilliant ability, but the attack was never really good enough to make it fantastic. Now, a card which I could have put right after Dialga, but I've left him a little bit, Palkia. Now, I've talked about hit and run Pokemon in these videos. Most specifically, I've talked about Donphan, and I talked about him in my Plasma Storm video. And as I keep saying in this video, I don't want to repeat stuff I've already told you. So I would encourage you to go back and look at the Donphan video for more information about these hit and run decks. But we're looking at Strafe here. It does 50 damage for free energy. You may switch this Pokemon with one of your bench Pokemon. And you could put up something like a Sigilif, which stopped your opponent attacking with basic Pokemon. With EX Pokemon. Or the Pyroar, which I was thinking of, because the Pyroar stopped your opponent attacking with basic Pokemon. Or you could put a Robo Substitute up, which stopped your opponent taking a bite. Essentially, you do the damage with Palkia, and you make your opponent kill something that isn't Palkia. And your Palkia lives for the entire game, which means if your opponent plays an N, it's okay, you've got your attacker out. You get to keep your energy, you get to keep your attacker. And because it's a Plasma Pokemon that attacks for colourless energy, you can tech it into any deck you like. You can play whatever basic energy you want with this, but you can also use Colress Machine, you can use double colourless energy, you can use Deoxys. There really is quite a lot of advantages to using this Palkia EX. Now, the Frostlast I talked about a moment ago was the kind of card that newer players would use. It was a nice introductory card. And the next card I want to talk about, I don't think is a very good card. In fact, I'm fairly certain it's not a very good card. But it is a wonderful starter card. I saw this played by a lot of players at League. A lot of new players, and it's a really good card for newer players. So I'm going to mention it here, because it deserves a mention, because although the competitive players who want to go to Worlds didn't play it very much, a lot of newer players did, and that's the Kangaskhan card. For 1 energy, you can get 2 basic Pokemon from your deck and put them in your bench, and for a double colourless energy, or for 2 energy, you can flip 4 coins and do 20 damage times the number of heads. Now, he was a beast at the Plasma Blast pre-release, and he's been played by newer players ever since. And that brings me to my final card that saw occasional play, Master Ball. And Master Ball was just universal Pokemon search with no downside. You can search for any Pokemon you want, no downside. Now it is an ace spec, which means you can only play 1 in your deck. Not dissimilar to Luxury Ball, if anyone remembers that one. Some people played this where they really wanted to get set up, but honestly, it was never as good as cards like Computer Search. I did see it seeing play, but not a huge amount. And Plasma Blast was not a great set. Plasma Freeze, I was rushing through that video and it ran well over 40 minutes. Here, we're already into our top 5. Plasma Blast, not a great set. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. It's top heavy with, 1 and 2 were just amazing. But the rest of the set really wasn't that good. So going into my top 5, and this one, Scoop Up Cyclone. Now, he saw a little bit of play here and there as, he's really a better Life Dew because he can't be beaten with something like Tool Scrapper. Scoop Up Cyclone is super scoop up, but you don't need to flip a coin. Pick up one of your Pokemon and all the cards attached to it. It means you can reuse Pokemon like Jirachi EX. It means that you can completely heal Pokemon without having to discard all their energy or stuff like that. It did mean you had to re-evolve and reattach energy. To be honest, this had a very small window of being brutally amazing, and that was when Lysandra's trump card was legal. And Seismitoad EX decks were everywhere. You would run through your entire deck using cards like Shaman EX, using hammers to get rid of energy, using Hypnotoxic Laser, and just pounding your opponent into submission. You'd get rid of all their energy and leave them poisoned all game. And this deck really relied on you healing Seismitoads and reusing Shaman EX, so Scoop Up Cyclone was very good indeed. In at number 4, we have Suicune and his Safeguard ability. Now, he was basically exactly the same as Sigilif, and it's very simple. It blocked attacks from EX Pokemon. Lots of decks, the vast majority of decks, had their main attackers as EX Pokemon, and this gave you immunity. You could make counter decks revolving around Suicune, but more likely you would use it as a one-off tech in other decks just to block your opponent if they only played EX Pokemon. If they didn't have a non-EX Pokemon in their deck, a Suicune would win the game. Why would you play him over Sigilif? He's got 10 more HP, which means Hypnotoxic Laser and Burbank City Gym takes 1 extra turn to kill you. If my opponent plays a laser on a 90 HP Sigilif, it does 30 after their turn, 30 after mine, and 30 after their next, and it dies. Whereas if I've got a Suicune, it does 30 after their turn, 30 after my turn, 30 after their turn, and it comes back to my turn with 10 HP left, and it gives me a turn to save it and stop my opponent taking a prize. But it had 1 more retreat cost than Sigilif, so it really was a, do you want 10 extra HP or an easier retreat? Coming in at number 3, a card we've talked about quite a bit this video already, Silver Bangle. It's very simple. You've got a non-EX Pokemon, your opponent's got an EX Pokemon, you do 30 extra damage. Now the question was this or Muscle Band. Muscle Band does 10 less damage, but can be used on an EX or against a non-EX. If you were playing a non-EX deck like Flareon, for instance, Silver Bangle was an absolute must, but you had to weigh it against Muscle Band, because against non-EX decks, Silver Bangle became useful. And I think the 1 and 2 here are just an absolute slam dunk. As always, if you disagree with my top 5, I encourage you to put your top 5 in the comments. Make sure you do an entire top 5, please. But in at number 2, Jirachi EX. And it's got 90 HP, it gives up 2 prizes, it's a terrible starter. But that ability, Stellar Guidance, just gave consistency coming out of the wazoo. Jirachi gave you a turn 1 supporter. If you played a Jirachi, that gave you 4 extra outs to getting, that gave you 1 extra out to getting a supporter on turn 1. That means if you're playing 10 supporters in Jirachi, you've got 11 cards that give you a supporter on turn 1. But you probably played 4 Ultra Ball, which means you've got 15 outs to a supporter on turn 1, because you can play an Ultra Ball for a Jirachi for a supporter. Now, Jirachi was often played by idiots instead of supporters. They'd play, 7 or 8 supporters and a Jirachi, and their deck would be inconsistent. Remember, you can start with Jirachi. Remember, he can be prized. But a lot of people who stuck a Jirachi in as extra consistency, and he really was a staple in almost every deck played him pretty much. He was just amazing. But he had other little things you could do. If your opponent has got 1 prize left, you can use Jirachi to grab an N. If you really need to take the last 2 prizes off a benched Pokemon, you can play Jirachi for a Lysandra. or something like Archie's Ace in the Hole, which has to be played when it's the only card in your hand, you can use Jirachi to grab it at exactly the right time. Nowadays, we've got VS Seeker, so you can just dump all of your supporters and grab what you want back with VS Seeker. But that only came about fairly recently. For a very long time, you would be using Jirachi, and he was your way of getting the exact supporter card you wanted. And at number 1, I am cheating. I really don't want to break these free cards up, so I'm putting really a deck as number 1 rather than a card. It's Virizion EX, it's Genesect EX, and it's G-Booster. Now, I believe it was in 2014 that Andrew Estrada won Worlds with Virizion Genesect. And actually, he came on my podcast, PTCGRadio, and did an interview shortly afterwards, so I encourage you to track that one down. I will try and pop a link in the description to that particular podcast. Point is, it won Worlds. And I'm pretty sure that in the final, he had to play Virizion Genesect. And in the top 4, he had to play Virizion Genesect. And in the top 8, he had to play Virizion Genesect. Now, I might have that slightly wrong, but it was something silly like 4 or 5 of the top 8 decks at Worlds were Virizion Genesect. It was the best deck in the format for a very long time. Virizion uses Emerald Slash to get energy onto Genesect. Genesect also takes advantage of cards like Colress Machine to get extra energy. And then Genesect uses this Ace-Spec tool card, G-Booster, to do 200 damage and one-hit KO anything. And you just repeated. And you just kept going and going until, well, you didn't keep going and going, you did it 3 times and you won the game against the X decks. It was just brutally brilliant as a deck. Now, it wasn't perfect. You needed to get Emerald Slash off, and any deck that could KO the Virizion before it got an Emerald Slash would probably win. But it really was just amazing. Now, both Virizion and Genesect did see a little bit of play otherwise. Virizion had his ability which got rid of status conditions for any Pokemon that had a grass energy attached. So in any deck that played something like Rainbow Energy or Grass Energy, you'd put a Virizion in to use that ability. Similarly, Genesect had his ability Red Signal that acted like Lysandra when you attached a Plasma Energy to him. So in any deck where you did or could play Plasma Energy, you'd put a Genesect in to take advantage of his ability. And in some decks like Kling Klang and Aromatisse, people would even put Genesect in just as a good grass attacker, even without G-Booster. But as the best cards in Plasma Blast, I really don't think you can argue. It ruled the format for a long time. Jirachi comes second, and I suppose you could put him first, although clearly I wouldn't, because I didn't. And that is everything you need to know about Plasma Blast. The cards we're losing for Standard and the cards we're gaining for Expanded. The usual deal, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure you like this video. Make sure you comment. Tell me what you think the best cards in Plasma Blast were. Were there any I looked at that you think weren't worth the time? And were there any that I didn't look at that you think I should have? And of course, make sure you subscribe to this channel and get a friend to subscribe if you already have. And of course, check out my video game channel, Wassy Plays. It's just like this, but for video games, and I have a sneaking suspicion that if you try it, you just might like it. Thank you very much for watching my final video in this little series. The cards we lose from Legendary Treasures will be out in a few days' time, and I'll also be showing you my top 10 cards from Ancient Origins in the meantime. Thank you very much for watching. Look after yourselves till next time. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.